Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the seventh in a series of interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture, A Spiritual Autobiography, from the Substantia lecture series. This lecture is available in written form in Bodhi Ocean, an ebook that is available on the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can listen to the full recording of many of these lectures on the lectures page. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website or on our YouTube channel. The URL for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com, and on our website you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He's a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and the Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome to the interview Richard Harvey. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking that after all these talks, we're still somehow inspired and enthused to new material, aren't we? Somehow.
Indeed. And I would say even more inspired than ever.
Yes, I know.
For those who might be seeing this this interview series for the first time, or those who have watched only a few of them, this is the last series, or the last interview for this series in the Substantia lecture series, but it's also the last interview in the entire 42 that we've done over the past almost 3 years.
Which should amount to 49 interviews, I believe.
Something in that magnitude. Something in that magnitude. It's, I think, quite appropriate that we end off this series, Substantia, and perhaps all of them, with this very interesting title, A Spiritual Autobiography, because an onlooker might think, well, this is Richard's autobiography. And at least the way I heard the lecture when it was originally given, and the way when I reread it, it feels more like an invitation by you to write one's own spiritual autobiography. And one of the core things, and what I want to focus on in this interview, is there's 6 elements that you share that come together to form this spiritual autobiography. And the first element you speak of is thought as being part of this spiritual autobiography. And you share it this way, quote, "Biography means charting a life. Charting a life implies a narrative form, some beginning, some end, and as we have briefly looked at, and auto, of course, means you do it. It is about you, considered and from your own perspective, you might say. The autobiography of anyone begins curiously, not in their life as such, but in their mind, in their thought patterns. Everything we see, touch, taste, smell, and feel is subject to some interference, or we should say interpretation, by these patterns of thought. We impose those patterns. We impose pattern by making associations, and these associations are implications of our life's experience, images which we overlay, or repeated patterns we see over and over in our minds, the products of our thoughts, the extensions of our mind. What if our biological narrative is no more real than these images we see in the sky, in the reflections of the water? What if the sense we have of ourself traveling, evolving, making his or her way through life are merely impressions, patterns of thought, a kind of stencil that our thought patterns insist everyone and everything in its way conform to?" End quote. I question, Richard, to open this up with this element, this first of 6 elements for the autobiography, is why is it important to examine our thoughts?
Just before we go in on that, just to say that I was very glad that a spiritual biography was humorous, shall we say, because I found it very humorous, and I never have felt that the spiritual journey, the spiritual processes and our relationship with the divine is necessarily so, blank of feeling, blank of somehow beyond feeling that we can't laugh. And we mentioned before about this series, Substantia, that the titles came and then I wrote the material down, and then I discarded all that material and I wrote it again because I really didn't understand most of what I'd written. So it was sort of note form, and so right to the end I was sitting with this idea of no, please, because I've had this push-pull with the autobiography thing, and most of the autobiographical stories that I've told have been encouraged by publishers or editors as a way of illustrating, I'm sure quite validly. But when I embarked on serious writing with the Flight of Consciousness, it wasn't my intention to talk about myself at all, as I've mentioned before. So this seemed to be a great joke, and I was really relieved to find that it wasn't literal, and I didn't have to, I was born in London and all this sort of thing. The reason that thought then is so important is because thinking, in the way that we experience it by and large, is an instrument of the ego processes. And you can, if you bring attention to the way in which you impose pattern and, as it said there in the talk, interpret events, and give form and give ownership and possession and a narrative thrust to your life, and this kind of possibly arbitrary sequence. I would say, go and sit we have trees here, I could go and sit in a tree and you see right now, leaves are falling off, there's going to be changes in the light, changes in the bark. There's no time at which the tree says, I'm now developing thus, or this is happening to me, and in any way takes ownership of the forces of nature. We, on the other hand, can't do it any other way, it seems. And what we do is we grasp it as a story, we grasp it as a narrative, and we take charge of it. And that's why that underpins the status and the prestige and the, who are you, Robert, and where do you come from, and what are you doing, and what have you achieved, and what's your ambitions, and all of this, as if it's a thread of some homogeneous beads on some sort of a line. You can say, this is my life. Well, is it? So this is the point. I think this is the central point about thought. We need to recognize thought in relationship to the narrative of our lives, and we need to consider its relationship to the ego process.
The second, leading out of that first, the second element you speak of in this lecture on the autobiography is action. So first comes thought, then comes action as elements of this autobiography. And you share it this way, quote, everyone is the central hero in his or her own drama of life. You are your own action hero, and like modern movies, you have to do to be seen, to make an impression, to be someone you must do. We too, in our lives, perhaps covertly crave drama. Without some drama, we may feel asleep. So the second level of biography reflects this fundamental need, the one to enact, to create dynamic tension and drama in relationships. In doing, acting, achieving, succeeding, and failing, some novelty, some content. Heaven forbid there should be none, no content. That we should be blank is a terrible state and not one you should own up to, and certainly not aspire to. End quote. My question is do our thoughts drive our action? Would there be any action if there was no thought?
Yeah, very good point. I'd say I go with that. I think the thoughts drive the action in order to fertilize the field of narrative, of story, and so on. And I think that if you enter into a serious spiritual practice and you notice that they are often to do with withdrawal from the senses, asceticism of some sort, or minimizing or simplification of some sort, you will find that there's immense narratives and stories going on. If you engage from day to day, even only for a few days, you will find, let's say, meditation, contemplation, or spending time in a monastery where not much may be going on. You will realize that there's a whole unfolding movie of drama in your mind, and it doesn't cease. And it takes quite a long time to calm it down, quite a long time to get bored with it, quite a long time to become disattached. As I'm sure you know. And at that point, of course, you're entering a door of being. And this is really what's the difficulty about action and thought and narrative, is not that the thing in itself, is fairly exciting and childish and, it's like early life. Let's go and play, let's have an adventure and all of this. But then a young child is doing that from within the core of being. As we get older, being is occluded. And as it becomes occluded, of course, we begin to feel the poverty of our existence. We become caught up in relationships of this kind, doings and actions and thoughts of all these kinds. In that sense, thought and action are not very different. Not very different. One perhaps the inner and one the outer of the same form.
First element being thought, the second being action, the third you speak of is emotions. And here's what you have to say. Quote, so now we have the thought patterns of mind and the compulsive action level of biography. This then is followed by the third level, and it is the emotional one. everyone has some form of emotional biography, autobiography going on. It is how we feel, our feeling engagement with life. Some people live this biography more than others, of course. Some people are more centered, more governed by emotion than, say, thought or action, in which case this level of autobiography is the stronger of the three levels. When you are primarily an emotional person, when this is the principal corridor through which you meet experience, you see, experience, and interact with the world, and are predominantly affected and motivated by feeling emotions. As with the previous element in question, do our emotions flow from our thoughts, our actions, or both our thoughts and actions? So is it a sequential process that's going on here? We have thought, we manifest it through action, and the result of that is emotion.
Or perhaps looking at it developmentally, emotion and then action and then thought. Because that, in a sense, is the reality of our early life. And I don't know if you ever saw it, but in that little transcript of Dow's gift, there's a very interesting exchange with a fellow in a group. And we talk about the thought and the emotion, and I propose intuition. And I propose being guided by emotion rather than thought and so on. It's very interesting because he's a rational person. But perhaps developmentally, emotion, action, thought, at which point you could certainly make a case, I think, for what you're talking about. But I think which would be thought, action, emotion, or thought, emotion, action. But I think, I'd prefer to... It's like a three-sided form somehow. It's like a three-sided form, and we know that some people are situated or centered here, some people are centered here, some people are centered here, primarily, in which case the order in which these three things, thought and action and emotion, are presented are not necessarily in any kind of priority, perhaps. It would be probably more important, listening to this talk, to consider if you were a primarily emotionally engaged person rather than a mental person, or a primarily active will-focused person rather than emotional or mental. Bearing in mind everybody, of course, is everything, but it's a kind of distribution. So as we talk about it now, I think I'd prefer to see it as just one form with all three somehow on different faces of the same singular form.
The way you express it is a beautiful segue into the fourth element, because it brings these all together. And that fourth element is what you refer to as wholeness. And you express it this way in the lecture. Quote, "And so it is, and it is so, over the last 100 years, we have had the concept of all-inclusiveness or holism. We can aspire less to being a specialist in life, a thinking, acting, or feeling individual, and more toward addressing the challenges of being all of these at once. The idea is that we embrace all of our faculties and, including the context in which we find ourselves, interact, identify, and harmonize, so the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts, a greater vision, a more expansive aspiration, a more inclusive experience of human existence. This then is the fourth level of autobiography, and it includes the perspective, specialties, and focuses of the first three, with the extra component of the whole, the greater whole, through the integration of all the parts." And you suggest, not only here, but around this quote in the lecture, that wholeness is incredibly important. Why, Richard, is it so important?
Psychological wholeness prepares us for the greater journey. So when Jung, for example, said this great journey that is left to mankind, and he was referring to the inner journey, of course, we have something very important. This is about 50 years old now, but 100 years old, even in the West, in psychology, of course, thousands of years old in Buddhist psychology and Tao psychology and Eastern psychology. We have this idea of bringing together not only that which we are aware of or conscious of or accept or find likable or presentable, but all of that which we don't. And then when you accept and invite those thoughts, those feelings and those actions which don't represent your partial definition of yourself as a personality and character, then what's happening is you're getting towards wholeness, and you have to sustain that. And as far as I can see, and I say it endlessly, you have to do it with a skilled, empathetic guide, counselor, somebody who knows the territory and can take you there. And it's utterly critical. And we could go on about this, but let me just punctuate it by saying one thing. We live, in my view, in a time when people are trying to be, what should we call it, in the ocean when they're not off the beach. You see what I mean? They're in some sort of another stage in some other place. Now, the ocean and the beach are a very important symbol anyway, because in dreams they represent the unconscious in the water meeting the conscious. I have my feet on dry land. And if your feet are on the beach and you're not in the water, in this metaphor, then you have not, strictly speaking, embarked on the spiritual quest, the spiritual journey. It doesn't mean you don't have spiritual sensibility or you don't have spiritual tendencies and you're drawn to spiritual things, but it does mean if you look at it really carefully and if you draw back, you say, how can I be in the depths of the ocean when I'm still playing on the edge of the shore? And the edge of the shore is the place where you incorporate, where you bring together all of yourself, everything you find inside. It's terribly hard to do, as you know. The reason it's terribly hard to do is from the very beginning we had to conform. We had to please the parents in order to survive. Sometimes we had to rebel against the parents so in order to survive, but nonetheless it's in the same dynamic relationship. And of course that isn't what an adult life or a self-directed life is about. That one you leave the parents behind. You say, well, this isn't acceptable to you, but I am that, and I will accept that in myself. Just one final thing, it also doesn't mean, of course, we should just cover this, that you go around behaving like a maniac. What it means is that you identify inside yourself the seeds of those sorts of behaviors that you normally marginalize, and you push away some members of the human race and say, well, I don't have that inside me. I mean, this person is insane. They're a sociopath or a psychopath or something. Well, maybe, but how about it's all inside all of us, and if we own it, if we accept it, if we bring it close to us, if we heal it, then some poor person who's more vulnerable or more power hungry or more cruel perhaps doesn't have to act it out, you see.
We began with thought, moved into action, then emotions. We've touched on wholeness. The fifth element in the autobiography you're suggesting is transformation. And here's a paragraph from the lecture. Quote, "Not everyone is inclined toward transformation. At this stage in human evolution, it seems that it is a minority only. As rare as it may be, transformation represents the natural life for a human being. Most people today are living in a remedial state of early childhood conditioning, by the time they enter middle years, old age, and prepare for death, little has changed. Their expectations, assumptions, and strategies in life are fairly much the same as they were when they were very young. Not much, if anything, has really changed. This is no way to live a human life. To accept the gift of human existence is to live life, to live spontaneously, vibrantly, pleasurably, with satisfaction and fulfillment, and the realization of one's authentic heart nature. To live life fully is to open the packaging, take off the wrapper, not to merely sit nursing the wrapped gift and saying thank you. Open the gift, see what is there, take the risk of revelation, come out from behind the veil of concealment. Transformation is all this and more, and the fortunate human being who realizes him or herself in this way can be said to truly live life, to truly embrace life, to feel truly grateful for life, and to meet the inherent obligations we all have to life, to respond, to celebrate, to take part in the ritual, existential litany of reciprocity, becoming one with life. End quote. Richard, is transformation a decision? And if so, what conspires in one's life to bring about the decision for transformation?
I don't think transformation is a decision. I think that the way, the means, the journey, that itself may be a decision. But I think transformation shouldn't be thought of as an individual choice, for the simple reason that it's a unself-conscious event. It's an event in life like no other, and therefore, if we were to choose it, even the choosing, even the thought, which reinforces the I of the past, would inhibit the transformation itself. So if we use transformation if we illustrate it in terms of the metaphor of crossing a threshold, I've never met anybody, and I certainly was not aware of myself transforming. And I think it's because you could say you're returning to the natural state, but it's rather more that you're letting go, you're just letting go, and whatever's there has always been there. So, in a sense, that it's an eventless event. I think what's probably more important than choosing transformation and all this is destiny and capacity and potential, and so therefore, at certain points in the psychospiritual inner journey, we turn to that if we get some information, some guidance, some help from the archetypal realms, from the God realms, from the realms of myth, from dreams, from fantasies, all this kind of thing, in order to identify the sense of potential, which is about content, the extent of the capacity, which is about scale, and the light that is beckoning us, so to say. Now, none of which is destiny, and none of this, of course, should be judged or considered greater than or better than me. Who is to know? Who is to know? Whether the person who appears not to have transformed and is doing something lowly in suffering and joy isn't beyond that threshold. Likewise, somebody who's being the guru or something may not be. So we have a difficulty here. It's difficult for us to objectively appraise this. But to return to the original question, I'd say don't choose it. Or I generally have to, when I'm in the role of guide, dissuade people from that thought, because I know it's an obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
I say, can you just be with whatever's happening? That's better.
Mm-hmm. Mm. We've journeyed through 5 elements: thought, action, emotions, wholeness. We just talked about transformation, and this leads us to the final element, which you refer to or call true nature. And you describe it this way, and there's a little bit of the lecture I share here. Quote, "The life of transformation is curiously the start, the very beginning of true life, and it augurs an exciting event. As the heart fills with love and compassion, so the receptacle or vehicle of your earthly being overflows with life force and life energy. This overflowing reveals the impersonal nature of love, life, compassion, and relationship itself. It reveals the truly authentic nature of relationship. That authentic relationship is not two. No separation exists in real relationship. No division, no prejudice, no sides, no partisanship, no giving, no taking, no individual stories, meeting, colliding, rebuffing, no potential possible or actual conflict, and neither confluence nor harmony or forgiveness or anything at all. You and the other in authentic relationship are not two, so there is nothing between you, nothing separating you from each other, not even love. In love, real love that is impersonal, there is only this one single consciousness, experienced as a flow, as an ocean, as play, as an inherent being state. However, it appears to your senses, it goes beyond. True love is beyond any and all experience, interpretation, and objectification. This 6th level of autobiography is the flowering of the human life. The true heart nature of love, compassion, authenticity, and inherent unity in the human experience is lived, not merely thought, acted upon, or even felt. It is lived as a central and consistent reality of life, since it is the actual reality of human form. So reflecting on these 6 elements, the last one being true nature, I wanted to ask you, Richard, is there a parallel among or between the 6 elements? So again, thought, action, emotions, wholeness, transformation, and true nature. Is there a parallel between those 6 elements and your 3-stage model of human awakening that underpins sacred attention therapy?
Yes, the 3 elements of thought, action, and emotion are, of course, the business of psychological counseling. What I call the process of self-discovery, which is the dynamic process contained in 1st stage awakening. You want to look beyond. You want to not have this trail of straggling thoughts and memories and feelings and emotions which are stuck and held and frozen, or actions that you regret or are attached to in one way or another, and so on and so on. So these 3 fields, thought, action, emotion, are surely what we at any time are dealing with in psychological therapy, and therefore they comprise the 1st stage of awakening. 1st stage of awakening ends. The climax is wholeness. The climax is the inviting of all the thoughts, all the things, and all of this, in order to realize I'm not any one of these, and neither am I even the sum of all of these. And wholeness then is the ultimate step in 1st stage awakening, which can be, and we should say not always is, but can be, and may quite naturally be, an overture into transformation. At the point of transformation and resonating throughout the 2nd stage of awakening, the heart opening of true nature is central. It's really what it's all about. We also say authenticity, and we're also deepening into relationship, but essentially all of it takes place in the heart, in the direct understanding that relationship and love, all emotions and thoughts and feelings and actions are not what they were when we experience them in the first stage of awakening. They are qualitatively transformed, all of them. And at some point, and I think this is an important point to make, because you didn't directly ask it, in the latter stages of second stage awakening in my model is a preparation for the third stage, naturally enough, in which a spiritual biography or any kind of autobiography wouldn't have any relevance, because you have learned through the second stage evolution that the person that you are is merely the clothing, so to say, the form of the divine, or the form of love, or the form of that which you certainly can't write a story about it. And so in the Nirvana teachings, the series of lectures we discussed before, there is this revision of love, of anger, of relationships, of forgiveness, and so on and so on. So in order to understand that all of these things, in fact everything, is very different in the second stage of awakening, the flowering of the human life, or the entering into the true human nature.
That brings to a finish our discussion of this lecture, which is the end of this series, Substantia, and the end of the 42. And I just want to finish by saying what an honor and a pleasure it has been. A remarkable journey over almost 3 years, and Spirit willing, perhaps we can come back and talk a little bit about that journey, because for me it's been transformative.
And I'd like to say how much I appreciate your close reading and understanding and taking in of the material. It's actually, every time you presented, it's been new to me. I don't feel possessive of it, but I do feel very powerfully your ability to enter into it, appreciate it, and to ask questions that involve your real engagement with it. And for that, I want to thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Robert.